My mother never insulted me. That is the first thing people need to understand, because women like her survive for decades inside families by refusing the kind of cruelty that leaves clean fingerprints. She never called me ugly. She never called me stupid. She never told me no man would ever love me, never slapped me in kitchens, never threw plates, never left bruises that could be pointed to later over coffee and whispered about by relatives. What she did was quieter, and because it was quieter, it got to live much longer. She corrected me. She adjusted me. She clarified me in front of other people until my own memories began sounding less reliable than her tone. If I told a childhood story, she would tilt her head and say, "That's not quite how it happened." If I described something painful, she would smile sadly and explain that I had always been more sensitive than most. If I cried over something real, she would reframe it into exhaustion, stress, hormones, grief, or confusion. She didn't erase me all at once. She edited me, line by line, year after year, until half the people who loved me believed her version sounded calmer than my own. If you're watching, tell me where you're from and stay with me, because the ending of this story took my mother 40 years to earn and me one night to finally give her. My mother, Gloria, was the kind of woman people admired from a safe distance. Polished hair, good posture, proper thank you notes, a talent for speaking in complete, measured sentences even when other people were emotional enough to embarrass themselves. She chaired committees, remembered birthdays, brought tasteful casseroles after funerals, and never arrived anywhere looking unprepared. To outsiders, she was dignity. To the family, she was order. To me, for most of my life, she was weather. Not good weather or bad weather. Just the thing you adjusted yourself around because resistance made you tired and no one else seemed to notice it moving. My father used to say that Gloria had a gift for keeping everybody settled, and that sounded like praise when I was a child. Later, I realized what it actually meant. Settled people are easier to manage. Settled children don't interrupt the story. Settled daughters don't insist too hard on their own meaning when a more elegant version is already being offered to the room. My older brother, Thomas, adored my mother for most of his life because he mistook being endorsed by her for being seen. My younger sister, Elaine, learned early that the easiest way to survive the house was to echo whatever Gloria had already decided was true. I was the only one who kept experiencing these tiny stings of unreality, these moments where something true would happen to me, and by the end of dinner, I would hear it retold in a form that made me sound different than I felt inside it. I didn't have language for that as a child. Most children don't. They only know that something in the room shifts after they speak, and somehow they come out of the moment looking less solid than the adult who responded to them. The first memory I have of it is from second grade. I came home sobbing because a teacher had humiliated me in front of the class for reading too slowly. My mother listened, kneeling in front of me with a washcloth in her hands as if she were attending to a fever, and when I finished, she said, "Sweetheart, I think what happened is that you felt embarrassed, and your feelings made the whole thing seem harsher than it was." I remember even then knowing those two things were not the same. Feeling embarrassed is not the same as being humiliated. But by dinner she told my father, "Anna had a hard day and got herself all worked up at school." Not the teacher humiliated her, not a child was hurt. Anna got herself worked up. A small shift, a neat one. But if it happens to you enough, your inner life begins developing under permanent revision. That was how she did it. Never big enough to call abuse, never small enough to forget. When I was 14, I found a note in my father's desk from the bank about a missed payment and asked whether we were in trouble. My mother heard me say it and laughed in the soft, composed way that made me feel theatrical before I had even opened my mouth again. She told my father, "Anna's imagination gets the better of her. She saw one envelope and decided the sky was falling." What I had actually asked was whether we were in trouble. That was all. But by the time the exchange was retold through her, I was no longer a girl who noticed something and asked a question. I was a girl with an overactive imagination. That distinction sounds trivial until you live inside it for decades and realize half your family still hears you through the first labels she assigned. By the time I was in college, the editing had become almost invisible because she had taught everyone to accept her voice as the final copy. If I came home upset about a breakup, she would say I had always attached too much meaning to ordinary disappointment. If I was proud of something, she would gently lower the temperature so I didn't oversell myself. If I disagreed with a family decision, she would tell the others that I was tired or stressed before I had even entered the room. There is a peculiar violence in being emotionally pre-explained. People stop responding to what you say. They respond to the interpretation of you that arrived first. The older I got, the more respectable it looked. That was the genius of it. When you are young, a controlling mother seems dramatic. When you are older, and she has become a charming widow with arthritis and a flower garden and framed grandchildren on the mantel, people are almost morally offended by the idea that you might still be hurt by her. They assume time itself should have softened everything. They assume older women become gentler because their voices get quieter. But quiet is not the same as harmless. Sometimes quiet is just efficiency, perfected by years of rehearsal. My marriage to Paul lasted 28 years, and one of the reasons it lasted as well as it did was that Paul never fully trusted my mother's version of things. He wasn't a hostile man, but he had an irritatingly good ear for tone. After one family dinner in our 40s, when my mother had corrected a story I told about how hard those first years of my marriage had been, Paul said in the car, "Your mother has a way of making your pain sound badly organized." That sentence stayed with me because it was the first time another adult had described what I had felt all my life without making me sound difficult for noticing it. I loved him more for that than I probably ever said. When Paul died, I lost the only person in the family who reliably treated my internal reality as equal to my mother's polished explanations of it. That changed the balance more than I understood at the time. Widowhood makes a woman vulnerable in ways that have almost nothing to do with romance and everything to do with narrative. People begin speaking about your life as though it now belongs partly to the community. They discuss what you need, what stage you are in, whether you are coping well, whether you are still grieving too hard, whether you should sell the house, take trips, get out more, date, pray, volunteer, smile, rest, visit grandchildren, downsize, move closer, move on. My mother stepped into that season of my life with the same efficiency she had always used, but now her tone sounded compassionate enough that even I struggled to resist it cleanly. If I stayed home too long, she worried I was withdrawing. If I said yes to dinner invitations, she praised me for being brave. If I mentioned still hearing Paul's key in my mind at the front door, she said grief had a way of making memory feel present. Again, the shift was small. Not Anna misses her husband. Grief makes memory feel present. The fact disappears. The framing survives. I almost married again when I was 58. His name was David. He was kind, patient, funny in a quiet, dry way, and one of the few men I ever met who didn't seem intimidated by sorrow that had aged properly. My mother liked him immediately, which should have made me more suspicious than it did. Not because I thought she hated all men I loved, but because she usually responded to anything important in my life with a period of measured control before she blessed it publicly. With David, there was none of that. She approved too fast. She told my sister he was steady enough to manage Anna, which I only learned later. That sentence alone should have ended the engagement. It didn't. What ended it was subtler. Over months, my mother began gently telling David stories about my rough phases, my tendency to spiral when I felt uncertain, the fact that after Paul's death I had rewritten certain years of my marriage in ways grief often causes. Nothing openly malicious. Nothing a man like David would hear as slander. Just enough context that when I had one bad week and panicked over some financial paperwork related to the house, he responded not to my actual concern, but to the fragile woman my mother had been sketching for him in soft pencil. We broke up 6 weeks later. He said he loved me but felt I was carrying more distortion than peace. Distortion. My mother's word, not mine. I didn't know that yet. I only knew the argument we had sounded strangely familiar, as if someone else's syntax had entered the room before either of us did. After David, I stopped bringing men around my mother. But romance was never the center of what she did. That's another thing people misunderstand. Women like Gloria don't need to steal husbands or burn careers down dramatically. They want something more durable than that. They want editorial control. They want to remain the most authoritative version of you in every room you both enter. That is why she did not explode when I pulled back from her after David. She simply adjusted. She became more publicly frail, more warmly interested in my schedule, more likely to tell people. Anna and I have always had such different memories of things. Different memories. Not a lie. Not even technically unfair. Just another gentle invitation for other people to split the difference between my life and her wording of it, which somehow always left her standing in the middle and me out on some emotional edge. The real turning point came after my 80-year-old Aunt Esther's birthday party, though I did not recognize it as the turning point until months later. It was one of those family gatherings where people our age wear sensible shoes and say goodbye 3 times before actually leaving. I was telling a story at the table about the summer my father taught me how to drive his old truck on the gravel road behind our first house. I had loved that memory my entire life because it was one of the only times my father was wholly relaxed and proud with me and not splitting his attention between my mother's moods and the world's demands. I was halfway through the story when my mother smiled, touched my wrist, and said, "No, darling, it wasn't you. That was Thomas. You always do this. You borrow his memories when you're sentimental." The whole table laughed lightly, not meanly, just enough to move on. But she was wrong. I knew she was wrong in the hard, immediate way the body knows where it broke a bone. I could still feel the cracked vinyl seat against the back of my legs. I could still smell gasoline and hot weeds. I could hear my father saying, "Steady, Annie, don't fight the wheel." That was my memory. My brother looked uncertain for a second, then shrugged and said maybe Mom was right. It had been a long time. My sister did that little tilted mouth smile she has when she is relieved not to be the target. And suddenly, I was not a woman telling a childhood story. I was a sentimental older daughter blurring things again in front of everybody. I drove home shaking. Not because of the memory itself, because I felt something in me finally tire of being handled so cleanly. If my mother had openly said, "That never happened, you liar," I could have fought her. But she never did that. She always gave people a softer exit from me, something gentler to believe, something that let them keep seeing her as gracious and me as simply less reliable. The next week, I went into my attic looking for the old metal box where my father kept registration papers and odd receipts. I had no real plan beyond rage and instinct. Maybe I wanted proof about the truck memory. Maybe I wanted to know whether my father had written anything down at all. Maybe I just wanted one object from my own past that had not already been narrated through my mother's mouth. I found more than I expected. At the very back of a dusty shelf behind holiday linens, and one lamp I never repaired, was a cardboard file box marked in my father's handwriting. Living room cabinet /TAPES. Tapes. I had forgotten completely that my father used to record family gatherings on one of those little cassette machines he bought for work, and then kept using for everything because he hated waste. Birthday toasts, Christmas dinners, summer cookouts. Sometimes he would leave it running on a side table to capture conversation for later, which we all mocked him for because none of us believed ordinary family talk would ever matter. Older people are often wrong about technology and right about memory in ways that only become obvious after they die. There were 15 tapes in the box, some labeled, some not. I spent the first hour in the attic just reading dates with my hands trembling. Then I took the whole box downstairs and borrowed a cassette player from Ruth next door because, apparently, the modern world had moved on and I had not prepared for analog truth. I expected nostalgia, muffled holiday chatter, my father's laugh, the scrape of plates, maybe enough to prove one or two details my mother had overwritten over the years. What I did not expect was to hear her editing me in real time with such precision that it almost felt surgical. On one tape from a Christmas Eve in 1989, I heard myself at 26 laughing about a promotion I had nearly turned down because Paul and I were thinking of starting a family, and I was afraid of overcommitting. I remembered that conversation as one of the few nights my father looked genuinely proud of me. But on tape, right after I finished speaking, my mother cut in and said, "Anna has always needed a little push to believe she can handle adult responsibilities." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. Then my aunt said, "She was the timid one always." Not cruelly, casually. Casually is how reputations harden in families. What stunned me was not the content. It was how efficiently the meaning had been redirected. In less than 10 seconds, a moment that should have been about ambition became one more chapter in the family anthology of Anna being delicate, hesitant, almost there. The tape that broke me came from the summer after my first miscarriage. I had told almost no one back then how hard that loss hit me, partly because the 90s were cruel to women in that particular polished way, where people acknowledged pain but expected quick recovery. My mother had invited family over anyway for Sunday lunch because, as she put it, life must be lived in the middle of life. On the tape, I heard my own voice quieter than usual, slower, clearly still bruised. Then I heard my mother, in that same warm hostess voice everyone always praised, telling someone near the buffet, "Anna is having one of her emotional periods. It's best not to get her started." Started. I had not said anything dramatic. I had not been yelling or unraveling. I was just grieving in a room that wanted roast chicken more than honesty. I sat in my living room at 64 years old listening to the architecture of my own diminishment and understood, for the first time without doubt, that my mother's version of me had not grown naturally out of concern. It had been built, repeatedly, socially, with witnesses, and because she never did it at volume, everyone who repeated her afterwards still believed themselves kind. The more tapes I heard, the clearer the pattern became. She wasn't only correcting facts. She was adjusting scale and tone, making my joy sound naive, my grief sound excessive, my certainty sound unstable, my anger sound hormonal, my caution sound fearful, my memory sound approximate. She left other people room to co-author it, which is why the damage spread so well. No one thought they were adopting a lie. They thought they were participating in the most reasonable reading available. That realization changed the nature of my anger. Up to that point, some part of me still wanted my mother to be frightened, cornered, repentant. After the tapes, what I wanted was far more precise. I wanted her to hear herself in a room where no one could say I was exaggerating. I did not confront her immediately. That would have been pointless. Women like Gloria are never weaker than when they are accused privately. Private accusation is where they become most beautiful, saddest, frailest, most wounded by your cruelty. No, I needed witnesses, but not random ones. Not the whole family either, because groups allow confusion to spread. I needed the people who had used her language most often. My brother Thomas, my sister Elaine, Aunt Esther. Ruth, who had known us 40 years and still occasionally said things like, "Your mother always understood your temperament best." And I needed my daughter Claire, because she had grown up under enough of it to feel its weather without fully naming it. The opportunity arrived through my mother herself, which remains one of the great satisfactions of the story. She announced she wanted a small family supper for her 82nd birthday at her house. "Nothing dramatic," she said on the phone, which is one of those phrases that almost guarantees the opposite. She wanted just family, no restaurant, no fuss, no gifts beyond flowers. She sounded delicate, composed, almost sentimental. 3 days earlier, I might have dreaded the evening. Instead, I accepted immediately and began planning. I transferred 6 tape clips to digital files with Claire's help. Not 20, not an avalanche, just 6, enough to establish pattern. Different years, different subjects, different rooms, same edit. I had them cleaned up just enough that the voices were unmistakable. I also printed short transcripts because older people hear truth differently when they can read it with their glasses on while pretending not to be shaken. That detail mattered. My mother taught me that presentation is half the battle in domestic wars disguised as civility. The night of the dinner, the house looked exactly as it always had on evenings when Gloria wanted to appear generous. Candles, linen napkins, her good blue serving dish with the silver edge, soft lamp light instead of the overhead fixture because lamp light flatters both food and power. She kissed everyone, touched my cheek as if we were peaceful, and asked whether I had finally been sleeping better these past few weeks. There it was, still at work. Even then, a pre-explanation. I smiled and told her I'd been remembering things more clearly lately. She tilted her head but said nothing. Dinner moved through the old familiar rhythm. My brother talked about his knees. Elaine complained about airline prices. Aunt Esther repeated a story about somebody's grandson buying a motorcycle. Claire sat across from me with the look she inherited from Paul, the one that says she knows something is wrong but trusts me to choose the timing. My mother was in radiant form, charming, slightly fragile, a little wistful, half the table laughing every few minutes. If I had needed one last reminder of why she survived this long, there it was in candlelight. Then after dessert, while she was still smiling over her coffee, she looked at Claire and said, "Your mother used to cry for days over the tiniest things when she was little. She's always had a dramatic heart." Everyone made those small, indulgent noises families make when they are being handed an old, familiar character sketch. Claire glanced at me. I set down my spoon. And because even after all those years my mother could not resist one more casual revision, I got to begin exactly where I needed to. I said, "Actually, before anyone tells one more story about me tonight, I brought something." My mother laughed softly. "Oh dear," she said. "Should I be nervous?" "No," I told her. "You should be audible." Then I took the speaker out of my bag. You have never seen a room of older relatives go still faster than when someone places a device on a linen tablecloth with purpose. My mother looked confused first, then amused, then something tighter. I said, "I've spent most of my life listening to all of you repeat who I am. Tonight I thought we could listen to where some of that came from." Then I pressed play. The first clip was the promotion conversation. My younger voice, hopeful and excited. Then hers. "Anna has always needed a little push to believe she can handle adult responsibilities." The room reacted exactly as I hoped, not with immediate defense, but with recognition. Not because it was monstrous in isolation, because they all knew that voice. Her party voice, her smoothing voice, her version-making voice. Before anyone could interrupt, I played the second clip. Then the third, the miscarriage lunch, the best not to get her started. The car story where she corrected my driving memory. A Christmas morning where she called me, the sentimental one, while laughing that I had a habit of remembering feelings more vividly than facts. My brother stopped smiling by the second clip. Elaine crossed her arms by the third. Aunt Esther actually said, "Gloria." Under her breath in that wounded, scandalized tone people use when they are hearing something they had always benefited from not hearing properly before. My mother tried to intervene after the fourth clip. She said in that perfect measured tone, "Anna, I think this is a very unkind way to reinterpret old family moments." Unkind. Reinterpret. Even then she was editing in real time. That was the beauty of the tapes. The more she spoke, the more she proved the mechanisms still lived in her bones. I slid the printed transcripts across the table. Then I said the sentence I had waited 40 years to say to her in front of witnesses. "You didn't tell lies about me, Mother. You trained people to doubt me politely." No one moved. Then Claire, my beautiful, steady Claire, looked at her grandmother and said, "That's exactly what you did to Mom when Dad died too. I heard it. I just didn't know what to call it." That was the moment the room truly turned. Because until then this could still have been framed as a daughter's grievance, old hurt, selective memory, family politics. But once another generation named the pattern, My mother lost the privilege of treating it as one more example of Anna being too emotional to understand her own life correctly. My brother rubbed his mouth and stared at the table. Elaine actually began crying, which irritated me more than if she had argued, because tears are what bystanders offer when they realize comfort bought them a front-row seat to someone else's diminishment. Aunt Esther said, "My God, Gloria, you did do that," as if discovering mold in a wall she had lived beside for years. And my mother, my elegant, polished, careful mother, did what I had known she would do the moment the room stopped leaning toward her. She reached for frailty. She put a hand to her chest and said she had only ever tried to help me make sense of intense feelings. She said I was weaponizing family memories. She said old tapes without context could make anyone sound wrong. She said she was being judged for loving me through difficult phases. Difficult phases. There they were again, all the familiar exit ramps. I let her speak. Then I played one last clip I had saved precisely because it left her nowhere soft to land. It was from a lunch 10 years earlier after Paul died. Her voice, low and confidential near the buffet table. If Anna starts, don't encourage it. She gets attached to her own pain and then can't find her way back out. That clip killed the room. Not loudly, not theatrically, but decisively. Because grief has moral clarity older people still recognize even when they've spent years overlooking subtler harms. You can laugh off childhood labels. You can excuse old family habits. You can even forgive competitive sisters and messy mothers if the room wants peace badly enough. But hearing a woman privately manage her widowed daughter's grief like an inconvenience to be socially contained, that is harder to decorate into concern. My brother stood up and walked to the window. Elaine started saying, I didn't know, which I believe, though not enough to excuse. Claire reached for my hand. Aunt Esther took off her glasses and said, all these years I thought you were too delicate, Anna. I'm not sure you were delicate at all. I think you were just being answered before you could finish. That line nearly broke me. Because that was the real theft. Not that my mother hurt me. That she got there first so often that even my pain became second-hand before it reached the room. The payoff people expect in stories like this is usually some explosion, some screaming confession, some dramatic collapse at the table. Real family revenge, the kind that matters after 50, is better than that. It's slower and more terminal. My mother did not confess. She did not repent. She did what she had always done, tried to rewrite the meaning of what everyone had just seen. The difference was that this time, the evidence arrived before her interpretation. That had never happened to her before. And for women like Gloria, that is the deepest possible humiliation. I stood up, gathered the transcripts, and said calmly, you don't get to tell them what I meant anymore. Then I left. I did not stay for cleanup. I did not soothe anyone. I did not comfort my sister or reassure my aunt or sit beside my mother while she reinvented the evening as one more tragedy caused by my intensity. I left her in the exact circumstance she had spent a lifetime engineering for me. A room full of people who had just heard enough truth to stop accepting the polished version first. That was the revenge. Not cruelty, not exile, not one final speech sharp enough to cut her in public. The revenge was that for the first time in her adult life, my mother had to spend the night in the company of people who could finally hear her edits while she was still making them. The weeks after that were quieter than I expected and much more satisfying. My brother called 3 days later and apologized badly, which is still an apology. Elaine sent flowers and a letter so full of guilt it exhausted me to read it, but at least she stopped using the word sensitive like it was a character report. Aunt Esther told 2 cousins, who told 2 more, and for once I did not care. Let the family discuss me. They had been doing it my whole life. The difference now was that they had new source material. My mother called once. I let it ring. She sent a card the following week with careful handwriting and no direct apology, only a paragraph about how painful it is when family chooses the harshest possible reading of long love. Long love. Even then, still editing. still converting injury into mutual misunderstanding. I threw the card away unopened after the first paragraph, not out of anger, out of hygiene. There is a point in life when older women stop mistaking access for duty. I had reached it. People sometimes ask whether I regret doing it in public. No. A private confrontation would only have created one more private version, one more quiet room where she could lower her voice and help me sound unreasonable for wanting my own life returned to me intact. I did not need my mother to understand what she had done. I needed the witnesses retrained. That is the part younger people often miss about revenge after 50. It isn't always about punishing the guilty person directly. Sometimes it's about cutting the invisible wires they ran through everybody else. The strange thing is that once I stopped hearing my mother's narration as truth adjacent, other memories returned to me more solidly. Not perfectly, because no life is archived without loss, but enough. Enough to know that I had not invented my own depth and then confused it for distortion. Enough to know that some of my most painful seasons were painful in exactly the way I remembered them. Enough to know that I was never too much in the way she taught people to say it. I was just inconvenient to edit cleanly. That is what made the final payoff worth all those years. Not that the family pitied me at last. Not that my mother was embarrassed. Not even that the room changed. It was that I left that house no longer hearing her voice as the final draft of me. She had spent my whole life polishing her version until it sounded smoother than my own. One dinner, 6 clips, one sentence at the right table, and suddenly I was louder inside myself than she was. If this story stayed with you, I've left another one on screen about a woman who thought she had married a widower until his dead wife walked into the room. Click that one next.